Alan entered his office, which had become his second home during his years of working at the hospital. Here he always felt in his place. Alan's work was challenging, but interesting and incredibly important. He had now become the head of the neurosurgery department at the Children's Hospital, but he had started as an ordinary surgeon. Alan remembered his first solo operation vividly. His heart was pounding and his hands were trembling as he stood in front of the operating room. As a young doctor who had just finished his internship, he was afraid of making a mistake. It felt as if the 8 long years of study had been in vain. He questioned his ability to perform surgery and doubted if he had the courage for it. However, as soon as he stepped into the operating room, his anxiety vanished. Before him lay an 8-year-old boy who had been in an accident with his parents. The adults had minor injuries, but the child had a serious head injury. He had a hematoma in his head that needed immediate removal to prevent catastrophic consequences, and only Alan could help the young patient. At that moment, the young surgeon felt a surge of confidence. The fear had dissipated, replaced by a clear plan of action in his mind. The team awaited his instructions, and with a nod, they began the operation. They worked together seamlessly, like a well-oiled machine. Everything went smoothly, just like in a textbook. The boy recovered quickly after the operation. Alan often smiled as he observed the little patient running around the hospital corridors with other children. The child had a long and happy life ahead of him. It was a relief to see that, but the thought of what could have happened was terrifying. Alan often wondered, what if that first operation had been a failure? Success in surgery was not always solely in the hands of the doctors. With more experience now, Alan knew that sometimes the gravely ill could be healed, while others, with seemingly less critical illnesses, would sadly pass away. The reasons behind these outcomes remained a mystery. Perhaps higher powers had their own plans for each individual. Alan quickly gained recognition as a talented young surgeon. It was flattering, of course, but the true joy came from the sincere gratitude of the young patients and their parents. When he looked into their happy eyes, Alan felt a warmth and lightness in his heart. He knew that he had a purpose in this world. Of course, there were also tragedies. Sometimes Alan could foresee the unfortunate outcomes in advance. Each time, it shook him to the core. However, he understood that he had done everything within his power. The young surgeon preferred to give his patients a fighting chance, even when other doctors had given up on them. He took on the most difficult and seemingly hopeless cases. Sometimes he succeeded in helping people, but sometimes, unfortunately, he couldn't. Nevertheless, Alan fought for each of his young patients until the very end, so that he wouldn't be tormented by guilt and regret. Alan didn't remember every patient, but some of them had left a lasting impression on him. It wasn't always the complexity or uniqueness of the cases that defined his memory. Rather, it was the personal connections that formed between the doctor and the patient during their treatment. For example, Alan would never forget Brenda Smith. The girl had been brought to the hospital from a distant district when she was almost 10 years old. He vividly recalled the moment he first saw her. The patient's condition was severe, evident even before he had seen her medical records. She was thin, pale, with bruises under her huge grey eyes. Her arms, as thin as twigs, rested on the blanket. "Hello, Brenda," Alan said with a smile as he looked into the patient's card. "You have such a wonderful name." "Good morning," she politely greeted, her weak voice slightly slurred. It was evident that the tumour had already affected her speech centre. She lived with her parents and younger siblings in a simple, not-so-wealthy family in the village. 6 months ago, she started experiencing dizziness. Then her condition worsened. She developed strabismus and her motor skills declined. Concerned, her parents took her to the town to see a doctor. Alan was well aware of the limited medical resources in regional towns. Brenda had wasted precious time there after multiple misdiagnoses of anemia and genetic diseases. it was discovered that she had a rapidly progressing brain tumour. Brenda's mobility decreased and her smiles became rare, but her thirst for life and curiosity remained. Unlike the local doctors, she never doubted that everything would be fine. During their first meeting, she confidently told Alan that once she recovered, her parents would take her to see the sea. Having never seen it before, she eagerly asked Alan to cure her quickly so she could finally go on the trip. Alan understood the complexity of Brenda's case. The tumour was exerting pressure on various parts of her brain, and without immediate surgery, Brenda's dream of seeing the sea would never come true. It took several days to prepare for the operation, during which Alan and Brenda developed a genuine friendship. Every morning, Alan visited Brenda's room, taking the time to chat with the cheerful patient. "I had a dream today," Brenda shared with her favourite doctor. "I was riding a dolphin. Can you imagine? Its back was smooth, and I was holding on to its fin while it smiled. When I go to the sea, I'll see dolphins, won't I?" "Of course," Alan nodded, determined to make Brenda's dream come true. The entire staff adored Brenda. Who wouldn't? She was sincere, open, and bravely endured her misfortune. She obediently took bitter pills and endured painful procedures without complaint. Other children, even older ones, would be frightened and cry, but not Brenda. She was curious about everything. Brenda bombarded Alan with questions. "How do you diagnose someone's condition through blood? What's that thing hanging around your neck? Is it a stethoscope? How do you perform brain surgeries? Isn't the skull hard?" Alan carefully answered each question, choosing his words to make them understandable to a 10-year-old. Brenda eagerly absorbed every word, her grey eyes burning with curiosity. Alan's heart ached at the sight of this tiny child, unable to walk or even sit up, with a weak voice and a thin body. What kept her soul alive? And yet, how much energy and curiosity she possessed. One of Brenda's questions caught Alan off guard. "Why did you decide to become a doctor?" she asked one day. The man smiled, feeling a bit embarrassed. Brenda unknowingly took him back to the past, to the most difficult and terrifying period of his life. Alan was 14 at the time, and his brother Paul was 8. Alan adored his little brother, but it wasn't love at first sight. Initially, Alan couldn't understand why his parents needed another child when they already had him. He was a perfect child, excelling in his studies, keeping his room clean, and obeying his parents. So why did they need this little intruder, demanding all their attention and energy? It was painful for Alan to see how his mother smiled at Paul's every gesture. "Oh, he's smiling. That's so cute. Look, Paul turned over on his tummy by himself. Paul is already holding a rattle in his hand." Alan was fed up with his mother's adoring reactions to every little gesture of his brother. So what if he can hold a toy? Alan, who had won first place in a school race, felt ignored by his parents' lack of praise. The baby's cries irritated him to the core. Alan, who used to enjoy spending time in his cosy room with books, found himself avoiding his home and instead running around with other boys in the yard to escape the sound of his brother's wailing. It seemed like Paul had taken away his previously happy life and his parents' attention. But as Paul grew up, everything began to change. The little boy started to look up at Alan with a gaze filled with trust and admiration. At first, Alan tried to ignore it, until one day Paul burst into tears when his tower of cubes fell apart. Alan fixed the situation, not out of pity or love for his brother, but simply to prevent his crying. Paul gave him that look again, and Alan couldn't help but admit that Paul clearly believed that his older brother was all-powerful. Since then, something had changed. Alan started developing a genuine interest in his brother. Playing with the baby and helping him explore the world made him feel strong, intelligent and responsible. As Paul grew up, he transformed from a chubby baby into a quick boy who loved playing yard soccer and excelled at climbing fences and trees. Alan was proud of his brother's agility and energy. Trouble came unexpectedly. Shortly after Paul started second grade and showed his talents in physical education, he even made it onto the local swimming team, passing a tough selection process effortlessly. Alan's heart filled with delight. Many of his friends had wanted to join the team, but couldn't make it, even after training specifically for it. One day, Paul was taken to an away competition, even though he hadn't trained much yet. Unfortunately, the bus carrying the young athletes got into an accident on the highway. The coach always made sure everyone was properly fastened before the journey began. However, it turned out that mischievous Paul unbuckled his tight belt to move about freely. The accident wasn't too serious, and most of the passengers only experienced a slight fright. However, Paul was unlucky. Since he wasn't wearing his seatbelt, he was thrown from his seat and hit his head hard against the wall. Paul didn't feel anything and immediately fell into a coma. He was quickly transported to the nearest hospital and connected to various sophisticated machines. The battle for Paul's life had begun. Alan vividly remembered those days. His parents were pale and silent. His mother frequently wept and incessantly called the hospital to inquire about her son's condition. Paul had undergone multiple surgeries, each time fueling Alan's hope for a positive outcome. The surgeons seemed to him like gods in their white coats, exuding intelligence and near omnipotence. But despite the passage of time, Paul remained unresponsive. On that day, Alan's parents were at the hospital for an unusually long time. When his father finally brought his exhausted mother home, Alan immediately understood the heartbreaking truth. Paul was gone. Adapting to this reality proved immensely challenging. The grieving parents had changed deeply. His father was rarely at home, disappearing for work and returning home intoxicated and aggressive. His mother seemed oblivious to her surroundings. She no longer prepared delicious meals for the family, showed no interest in Alan's academic achievements, and even abandoned her favourite TV series. She moved through life like a machine, burdened by some heavy duty. Alan felt an almost physical pain from the inability to converse with his brother, to gaze into his curious blue eyes. He yearned to share his thoughts with someone, but his friends would not understand. His father was always absent, and his mother remained indifferent. Thus, he bore the burden alone. Initially, Alan harboured anger towards the doctors. Why couldn't they save his brother? After years of studying, were they unable to cure him? Perhaps Paul had simply been unfortunate to fall into the hands of these inept doctors. If only there had been a different, competent doctor, they could have saved him. The anger within the teenager grew stronger with each passing day. Why should his entire family suffer because of the laziness and incompetence of a few doctors? One day, Alan could no longer bear it and went to the hospital. He sought out the surgeon who had operated on his brother. The boy himself was unsure of what he expected from this encounter, but his soul demanded action. He burst into the office on the second floor and found a weary elderly man with red eyes from lack of sleep. "What can I do for you, young man?" he asked politely. Alan poured out his heart. His emotions flowed unabated as he expressed his pain and anger. He expected the doctor to kick him out at the start of his impassioned rant. However, the man listened attentively, without interruption. His eyes conveyed both attentiveness and profound sadness. "Of course, I remember Paul. His case was severe, and his brain suffered significant damage. We tried our best, fought for his young life until the very end." The doctor proceeded to explain the details of Paul's condition to the 14-year-old. He also provided insights into the structure of the human brain. Alan listened in awe, finally comprehending numerous aspects of the situation. Initially, Paul had slim chances of survival due to the unfortunate nature of his fall. However, the doctors fought tirelessly, performing surgeries, monitoring and supporting him. The doctor even showed Alan scans of Paul and other patients, enabling the boy to see and understand everything for himself. It was after this conversation with the doctor that Alan resolved to become a surgeon himself, specializing in brain surgeries to save people. He immersed himself in reading once again, but now it was books about anatomy. This new world fascinated and captivated him more each day. His parents did not particularly encourage his newfound passion. They seemed oblivious to Alan's existence. Each family member was consumed by their own emotions, finding solace in their own individual ways. One would assume that after losing one son, both mother and father would focus all their attention on the remaining one. However, they unexpectedly became completely indifferent towards Alan. Taking matters into his own hands, Alan found out about the admission requirements for the medical academy, searched for a hostel and tutors. And everything turned out well for Alan. He successfully enrolled, relocated to the capital, commenced his studies, and eventually began working. His parents appeared to rejoice in his successes, but their grief still consumed them. Years passed, yet little had changed. Alan attempted to convince his parents to seek help from a good therapist. However, they refused, assuring him that nothing was wrong with them. Alan reconciled. After all, they couldn't be taken there using a leash, could they? Alan did not share any of this with little Brenda, but she was still waiting an answer to her question, why he chose the profession of a doctor. Well, I really wanted to help little children. The man finally found his voice. I want you to run, jump and be carefree again. You enjoy having fun, don't you? Of course, the girl smiled. When I can walk again, the first thing I'm going to do is have a big frenzy of screaming, jumping and catching up. That's a wonderful plan, Alan approved. He promised Brenda that everything would be all right. What else could he say when she asked? However, in reality, her condition was severe and the prospects were rather bleak. Alan truthfully informed Brenda's parents about the risks involved in the surgery. They listened calmly without shedding tears, having hysterics or making threats. Aggression? This was not uncommon among parents of challenging patients, and Alan understood these mothers and fathers. Years ago, he himself stormed into a doctor's office in a fit of rage. People who are losing or have lost a loved one always seek someone to blame. Yet Brenda's parents remained strong. It was evident that they were filled with fear and worry, but they also held on to hope. You see, anything can go wrong on the operating table. The tumour is large and it puts pressure on many parts of the brain. This is a significant risk. However, if we don't perform the surgery soon, Brenda won't have any chance at all. We agree, said Brenda's father, squeezing his wife's hand. He nodded. Everyone except you has given up on Brenda, but this way at least she'll have a chance. I'll do my best, said the doctor, and he did give his all. He poured his heart into it as he always did. He worked meticulously, careful not to touch the healthy regions of the brain. Challenging tasks always motivated and energized Alan, and this time was no different. Brenda's tumour presented a formidable challenge, but Alan skillfully removed the tumour, leaving no trace of it. Now, all that remained was to wait. Were any critical brain areas damaged during the operation? The answer would only become clear once the girl emerged from anaesthesia. Alan stayed on duty throughout the night following the operation. He spent a few hours organising paperwork before resting on the couch. He was awoken by a gentle knock on the door. Brenda is awake, the nurse informed him. Thank you, Alan nodded. He tried to remain calm, although his heart pounded in his chest like a trapped bird. Brenda was laying on the bed, just as she had before the operation. Alan immediately recognized her curious eyes and breathed a sigh of relief. Brain surgeries often change people drastically, sometimes rendering them profoundly disabled. "Well, baby, you're a real hero." Alan sat down on the edge of her bed with a smile and, stroking her hand, asked the usual questions. If she had a headache, if her vision was double. Brenda answered, and her speech was no longer slurred. Of course, she was still weak, but it was only temporary. With every day, Brenda grew stronger. Just a week after the operation, she had already started standing up. How thrilled she was to be able to move again. Brenda had spent months confined to her bed, and now she could move freely. It was nothing short of a miracle. "I can run, jump, dance!" The little girl shared her joy with Alan. "And when my mum and dad take me to the sea, I'll learn to swim there, and maybe even swim with a dolphin, just like in my dream. Oh, I didn't tell you. I dreamt about a dolphin while I was under anesthesia. I wasn't even the least bit afraid of it." Alan smiled. "But be careful not to run too fast. You're not ready for that yet." "But I want to," argued the girl. "Your corridors are so long and wide, it's as if they were made for running." Soon Brenda made friends with children from other wards and became their little leader. Alan would scold her occasionally, just for the sake of maintaining order, but in reality it was good for Brenda. A moderate amount of activity accelerated her recovery. After the operation, Brenda needed to work on her finger dexterity, and children's arts and crafts were perfect for that. When Alan mentioned this to her parents, they immediately brought her various materials: cardboard, scissors, clay, glue, paint. Now Brenda was creating a lot. As Alan passed by her room, he often caught her in the midst of creating another masterpiece. She had started drawing and improved with each passing day. Her fine motor skills were developing rapidly. Alan couldn't be happier for Brenda. This child had very little chance of survival, let alone a full life. All the other doctors had given up on her, but he took a chance. And what a result! Brenda would live. It was truly a miracle. Cases like Brenda's gave Alan the strength to keep working and endure the failures that, though not frequent, still occurred in his practice. Some patients were beyond help. Alan took each loss to heart, despite it being unprofessional. Stories like Brenda's were a source of support, encouragement and inspiration. On the day of her discharge, Brenda looked a little sad. "I'm going to miss you," the girl said, glancing at her doctor. "We've become such good friends, and now we have to say goodbye. It's so sad." "I'll miss you too," Alan admitted. Brenda's words touched him and filled his heart with warmth. "But I hope you won't need to see doctors often in the future." "Doctors are the best people," Brenda declared fervently. "I've got a present for you." Saying this, she took out a small box from her purse. It was a cardboard box, covered with shiny foil and decorated with tiny roses made of red paper. "What a beauty!" Alan marvelled. He was truly impressed with the creation he had received. The girl's fine motor skills were impressive. Not everyone could build such a box. It was surprising how quickly she had recovered. "I made it specially for you," Brenda admitted. "It took me 3 whole hours. Do you like it?" "Very much." Alan nodded seriously. "This box will take an honourable place in my collection. Here, look." With these words, he walked over to the shelf. Brenda was not the first little patient who had thanked the doctor with a handsome gift. Alan had a good rapport with children, so he had quite a collection of these creations. He kept the children's creations carefully and cherished them. The little patients put so much effort into pleasing him. These cute things had a special energy. Alan placed Brenda's box in the very centre. "Well, good luck to you," Alan smiled in farewell. "We'll see each other again some day," Brenda promised. "Better not." These words Alan uttered when the door had already closed behind the girl and her parents. If they saw each other again, it would mean only one thing. The disease had returned, and Alan didn't want that. However, he could not imagine how fate would bring them together once more. 20 years had passed since Brenda's discharge. A lot had happened in Alan's life during that time, both good and bad. The man lost both his parents in the same year. His father was poisoned by cheap booze and had completely collapsed by then. Only his mother somehow helped him to keep a human face. Alan had tried many times to treat his father, putting him in hospitals, but it was all in vain. Doctors are powerless if the patient himself does not want to recover. And his mother had a heart attack soon after her husband's funeral. Alan realized that both parents had never coped with the loss, could not move on, and even Alan couldn't help them. As for Alan believed that it was his work that pulled him through. Every child's life he saved, he mentally dedicated to his brother. That's probably why the man was sure that Paul had come into this world for a reason. Thanks to what happened to his brother, Alan entered the medical profession and treated children. This thought was very supportive for the man. Alan felt the loss of his parents deeply. Even though they did not communicate much, the man always knew that they were people who loved him, always waiting for him and proud of him, and he was not ready to be completely alone in this world. During this difficult period in Alan's life, Debbie appeared. They met quite by chance at the birthday party of Alan's colleague. Alan noticed her at once, a tall, slender young woman with sad eyes, long wavy hair, thin hands with graceful fingers, high cheekbones, and for some reason, sad eyes. The man really wanted to unravel the mystery of this silent beauty. Why was she sad? Somehow, he was immediately drawn to her. Summoning his courage, Alan asked her to dance. Luckily, she agreed. It turned out that she was a cousin of Alan's colleague. The young beauty worked as an economist in an oil company. After leaving the party together, Alan and Debbie spent their time wandering around the city, sitting in cafes and getting to know each other through endless conversations. Soon they both realized that they couldn't imagine their lives without each other. Alan never expected to find someone so understanding, sensitive and loving, who could sense even the slightest change in his mood and knew how to cheer him up in any situation. Finding happiness in Debbie came as a complete surprise to Alan. Just holding her hand, looking into her eyes, and seeing her beautiful, warm smile was enough to make him feel completely happy. Alan eventually discovered the reason behind Debbie's sad eyes at the birthday party. Luckily for him, she had broken up with her boyfriend just the day before. Although they were already preparing for the wedding, Debbie caught the groom with another woman. Upon learning this, Alan silently thanked fate for such a gift. He and Debbie got married and fulfilled their dream of moving out of the city. They bought a wonderful house with a spacious garden, away from noisy roads and crowds. It was the perfect place to relax and unwind after work. The house had many rooms, and the couple planned to dedicate 3 of them to their future children. They both dreamed of having a large family. However, the first year of trying to conceive did not yield the desired results. The couple remained optimistic, knowing that it sometimes takes time. They felt like the miracle they were hoping for was just around the corner. But it didn't happen. The miracle did not occur the following year or in any subsequent year. Naturally, the couple sought medical advice and underwent comprehensive examinations. Debbie faced serious problems, and so years of treatment commenced. The woman dutifully followed all the doctor's prescriptions, never missed appointments, took medications, endured painful procedures and unpleasant examinations, all in the hopes of filling the empty children's rooms in their home. Yet nothing seemed to work. Alan was sorry for Debbie, and one day Alan decided to have a serious conversation with her. Maybe that's enough? You are sacrificing yourself, wasting time and nerves, and jeopardizing your health. I love you, and I don't want to see you suffer. Let's live for each other." "I love you too," Debbie smiled sadly. "And that's why I will give you a son. You'll see, everything will work out. I have a special intuition." Alan let out a heavy sigh, attempting once again to convince his spouse that she didn't need to endure such suffering for his sake, that her own well-being was what truly mattered to him, and it didn't matter to him whether she gave birth to a baby or not. But Debbie turned out to be right. Just a couple of months after that conversation, a miracle occurred. Alan vividly remembered the morning when Debbie said that the pregnancy test was positive. The joy that radiated from the expectant mother's eyes was immeasurable. Alan was left breathless by her words, and tears suddenly welled up in his eyes. But as a doctor, he understood that not all pregnancies end with the birth of a baby. Nevertheless, they now had at least a chance. Pregnancy turned out to be quite difficult for Debbie. She almost lost the baby multiple times at different stages and had to visit the emergency room frequently. However, she never complained and followed all the doctor's recommendations, taking care of herself like a fragile object. It was an anxious and exciting period, with many ultrasounds revealing that she was expecting a boy. "I told you I would give you a son," rejoiced Debbie, "and then 2 more daughters. We have 3 children's rooms." The threat persisted throughout the pregnancy. The doctors did their best to support Debbie and maintain the pregnancy for as long as possible, but it was a challenging time for everyone involved. Labour began earlier than expected, luckily while Debbie was in the hospital. The baby was born weak and immediately placed in a special medical box for premature babies. The doctors couldn't provide a prognosis. Debbie demanded more precise information from the doctors, but Alan knew the feeling. He had been in similar situations before, where everything depended on unknown factors. Now he found himself in the same helpless and anxious role as a parent. The baby boy was named Kyle, in honour of Debbie's grandfather. He was also born weak and premature, but against all odds he survived and grew up to be tall, strong and intelligent. Little Kyle initially had trouble breathing due to underdeveloped lungs. After addressing this issue, serious vision problems were discovered, putting him at risk of blindness. Alan sought help from his connections and had the child operated on at the country's top ophthalmology centre. It seemed like a success. During this time, Kyle had to live in the hospital and be constantly under the doctor's supervision. Debbie and Alan visited him often. With time, the baby started to resemble ordinary, adorable infants, with chubby cheeks and curious eyes. When Kyle was finally discharged at 6 months old, the couple celebrated in their living room, sipping wine near the fireplace and looking at their little Kyle, who was peacefully sleeping. Debbie and Alan discussed their son's future and made plans. The threat to their baby's life and serious health problems were finally behind them. While Kyle still had a long way to catch up with his peers, he could see and would soon start walking and talking. When Kyle was born, the doctors prepared the parents for the worst. Against such bleak prospects, the minor health problems seemed insignificant. Not everyone was born to be a superhero. "I think our Kyle will be clever," reasoned Debbie about her son's future. "His eyes are so attentive, as if he already understands everything." Alan smiled, not noticing anything extraordinary. To him, Kyle was just a child. The most important thing was that he was alive and relatively healthy. Life continued as usual. Alan worked hard, as the number of patients seeking his expertise as a neurosurgeon didn't decrease. Debbie took care of their home, preparing delicious dishes and creating a comfortable environment. Alan always returned home with great joy, greeted by the enticing aromas from the kitchen, cleanliness, and the presence of his wife and son. This was true happiness. However, Kyle's situation was not so simple. The consequences of his prematurity continued to affect his health. He frequently fell ill, and not like other children who quickly recovered. Instead, Kyle was hospitalized 5 times with pneumonia before the age of 3. He grew up weak, pale, and often sickly. Sometimes Alan's heart ached with pity and tenderness when he looked at his fragile and vulnerable son. Kyle quickly got tired of playing with his friends on the playground. The other children ran around the square, engaging in noisy battles and laughing a lot. Kyle eagerly wanted to join in on the fun. However, his energy quickly depleted, and he would return to his mother or father on the bench. He would sit there for the remainder of the outing, watching his peers with longing. It was a sad sight. But Alan was confident that Kyle would outgrow this. After all, he had overcome many challenges since birth, and he would overcome this as well. Sometimes Alan and Debbie discussed having a second child. Initially, they had planned to have a large family. However, looking at Kyle now, they felt apprehensive. At least their son was not disabled, but there were so many risks involved. Debbie herself had a difficult pregnancy and was on the verge of collapsing multiple times. The couple was scared and hesitant to plan for a second child, fearing a similar or worse outcome. Debbie often accompanied Kyle to clinics and rehabilitation centres. The boy required a lot of attention and care, more than healthy children. He received guidance from various specialists, including sports coaches, osteopaths, and experts in early development. The results were evident, particularly in terms of his mental abilities. At the age of 4, Kyle could already read slowly and handle numbers up to 20 with relative ease. "Little genius," acquaintances would jokingly call him. Alan was proud of his son. It was a joy to witness his child's achievements. However, physically, Kyle remained weak. He couldn't even be sent to kindergarten due to his susceptibility to infections. Alan pushed away negative thoughts and reassured himself that the doctors were closely monitoring his child, finding no serious issues. Yet Alan had a nagging feeling. He had encountered many children throughout his career and had learned to distinguish between ordinary children and those facing difficulties. Unfortunately, Kyle fell into the latter category. Alan kept his suspicions to himself, not wanting to burden his already worried wife. Perhaps she sensed it too. Trouble struck on New Year's Eve. Kyle stayed a bit longer than usual with his mother on the slide. The weather was warm and large snowflakes fell from the sky, creating a beautiful scene reminiscent of a New Year's card. Kyle didn't want to go home. Debbie agreed and allowed her son to play in the snow with the neighbouring kids. As usual, Kyle quickly grew tired and sat down on a bench closer to his mother. However, he refused to leave. He was sitting there with a smile, watching his peers build a snow fortress. But then the boy didn't have the strength to return home. Debbie carried him to the porch, as she always did. Kyle was only 4.5 years old, but he weighed as much as a 2-year-old. By evening, Kyle's temperature had risen. It seemed he had sweated while playing on the slide and then became chilled on the bench. The next morning it was clear that hospitalization was inevitable. Kyle had a high fever that wouldn't respond to antipyretics. Upon arrival in the hospital, Kyle was taken directly to the intensive care unit, and his parents were sent home. Debbie cried throughout the journey, blaming herself. "I should have taken him home immediately, but he wanted to stay. It's all my fault." Alan tried to console his inconsolable wife, but his attempts were not very successful. Kyle was diagnosed with bilateral pneumonia once again. This time, he was in critical condition in the intensive care unit. Alan and Debbie spent sleepless nights anxiously awaiting every phone call. Alan kept some information from his wife. Using his connections, he asked the attending doctor not to disclose the alarming details to Debbie. Kyle's life was hanging between life and death. He was hooked up to machines and receiving strong medications. Each passing day made it less likely that the boy would survive. Secretly, Alan sought help from prominent professors, desperately searching for a solution to save his son. It was difficult to go through this alone, but he couldn't bring himself to tell Debbie about Kyle's critical condition. Fortunately, the treatment was effective, and Kyle slowly started to improve. Alan felt a sense of relief, as the son's life was no longer in danger, even though he remained in intensive care. However, the intensive treatment and serious illness had left their mark. Kyle had been cured of pneumonia, but at the cost of acquiring a heart defect. The medications given to him had various side effects, but at the time there was no opportunity to discuss the potential harm of the treatment. Kyle's health now had consequences that couldn't be ignored. In addition to his other problems, Kyle now needed to see a cardiologist. Initially, Debbie was relieved when the immediate threat to her child's life had passed. However, the new problem threw her unbalanced once again. The doctor's prognosis sounded almost like a death sentence, as Kyle's condition continued to deteriorate. Debbie, for the sake of her son, gathered her strength and resolved to fight for him. Alan admired her resilience during this difficult time. She had to stay by Kyle's side in hospitals, follow the doctor's numerous recommendations, and manage a strict schedule of physical exercises, medications, and constant monitoring of his heart rate. These responsibilities kept Debbie's mind occupied and prevented her from succumbing to despair. She was determined to move forward and fight for her son. Unfortunately, Debbie was unaware of the complete truth. Kyle needed surgery. It was a complex and lengthy procedure that had been postponed. Debbie believed it was because of her baby's weakness from the previous pneumonia. In reality, no surgeon wanted to take on such a high-risk case. Alan knew that the chances of Kyle surviving the long operation were slim. He had sent his son's medical records to various medical centres and clinics, even those abroad. The responses he received were all similar. Alan realised that without surgery, his son's condition would continue to deteriorate, and they, as parents, could only watch helplessly. Coming to terms with this reality was difficult. Though no one could provide an exact timeline, Kyle's life expectancy was limited. Maybe a year or two, but no more than 5. However, surgery was a tremendous risk for Kyle. It may not help, and could even hasten the end. The boy might not wake up from anesthesia, and the delicate manipulation of his small heart required the highest level of expertise. No surgeon was willing to take on such responsibility. Alan felt hopeless. Losing his son and fearing for his wife, he knew that if the worst happened to Kyle, Debbie would struggle to bear the pain. That evening, Alan was sitting in his office, trying to catch up on work after a long day. He didn't rush home since there was no one waiting for him there. Debbie was once again with Kyle in the hospital, ensuring he received supportive therapy. Unlike Alan, his wife still held on to the hope that everything would turn out fine. She remained unaware of the true severity of the situation. The letters on the report danced before his eyes, and he couldn't concentrate. Exhausted from the day and consumed by worry for his son and wife, Alan decided to call it a night. Before heading home, he would have a cup of coffee to keep himself awake during the drive. As Alan made his way to the coffee machine at the end of the corridor, he spotted Jonathan, a colleague and long-time friend from the cardiology department. Jonathan had done his best to help Alan during this difficult time, using all his connections. Alan was grateful for his support. "Hello." Jonathan approached Alan, holding a cup of steaming Americano. "What are you still doing here? Why aren't you home?" Working hard, Alan replied with a smile. Good. I have great news for you. I intended to tell you tomorrow, but since you're here, I'll share it now. Your Kyle has a real chance of recovering. Alan looked at Jonathan with a mixture of hope and skepticism. He wanted to believe, but he had experienced disappointment before. There is a young cardiac surgeon working in University Clinic. She graduated from the medical academy not so long ago, but she has already gained experience. She cooperates with foreign clinics, is fond of scientific work and innovations. It's a mystery how she manages to keep up with everything. This doctor specializes in children, and she's already helped some patients with severe heart defect. Strange. Alan was surprised. It turns out that she is a star in the world of medicine. But why don't we know anything about her? She's a rising star. Her fame is still ahead of her, and very soon everyone will know about her, Jonathan assured confidently. I contacted her and sent her Kyle's story. I haven't even told you anything, so you wouldn't get your hopes up. I can see how hard it is for you. But tonight she sent me a reply that she was ready to take Kyle for surgery. And you have a meeting the day after tomorrow. I've already agreed with the chief. They'll let you go. You'll fly to her. Everything will work out. She is very talented, and she already has a lot of experience, so don't look at her age. And so, 2 days after this conversation, Alan was sitting in front of the office of Dr. Smith, the young female surgeon who was to save his son. To this time, the man had learned a lot about her, where she studied, where she practiced, what she excelled in. According to everything, it appeared that Dr. Smith was really a young talent. In her practice, there were many complicated cases. Alan has seen pictures of her, young, beautiful, big-eyed, more like a model than a cardiac surgeon, and yet Alan saw something vaguely familiar in the face of the young doctor. She looked very much like someone, maybe of an actress or a singer. Now Dr. Smith was on her rounds. According to the staff, she was very attentive to her little patients. Finally, light footsteps were heard at the end of the corridor. Alan's heart pounded excitedly. When she reached Alan, the man again experienced a strange feeling. Somewhere he had already met this woman. Dr. Smith smiled kindly at him and invited him into her office. This smile made the man's heart warm. Apparently, Dr. Smith is an open, sensitive person. It is always easy and pleasant to work with such people. In the office, Alan involuntarily looked around. Everything was just like his own, shelves filled with books, folders with papers, piled with documents, a table, a couch in the corner, and even a shelf with children's creations. Seeing this mini-museum, Alan smiled. "Grateful patients?" he asked, nodding at the shelf. "Exactly," Dr. Smith smiled. "Please sit down." "I brought Kyle's medical history." Alan handed the young doctor a puffy folder with documents. "Your colleague has already mailed it to me. I familiarized myself with your situation, and even the treatment plan is ready. I can't say it will be easy, but I think we can manage. In my practice, there was a similar case, only with a girl, and she was even older than your son. She's fine now. Believe me, we'll do everything possible and impossible for Kyle." Alan asked Dr. Smith questions about the treatment, and she answered in detail, thoroughly, thoughtfully. The man quickly realized that he was facing a professional, an innovator. It is such people who move medicine forward. This girl has a great future. She will save more than 100 lives. And even more, because her methods and schemes will be used by other doctors. On top of everything else, Dr. Smith turned out to be an incredibly pleasant person. She looked at Alan with sympathy, tried very hard to support him, to cheer him up, understand how hard it was for him. When the formal questions were over, Dr. Smith suddenly asked the man an unexpected question. "Don't you recognize me at all?" Alan looked more closely at the young cardiac surgeon's face. Those grey eyes of hers. "Your eyes, they look very familiar," Alan admitted. "But I can't remember where we've met before." "No wonder," Dr. Smith smiled. "It was so long ago, after all. I was barely 10 years old then. I'm Brenda Smith, one of your patients." "So that's it." Alan slapped his palm on his forehead. "Well, of course. I'm so glad you're doing so well." "Thanks in part to you," Brenda smiled. "You saved my life back then. They didn't want to take me on. They had already written me off. My dad told me about it later. I will do everything to save your son. It's amazing what fate has decreed. Now Kyle will become my patient. It's no accident. I believe in signs. We surgeons are superstitious. Well, you know that." "Yes, I do. I believe in signs too. That's how fate works." "Now I find myself in your parents' shoes." "It's scary to imagine, but don't worry, everything will be fine." Soon after that conversation, Kyle was transferred to the hospital where Dr. Smith worked. The young doctor immediately found a common language with both Kyle and Debbie, both of whom literally fell in love with the smiling young doctor. Brenda's presence alone gave them confidence in a happy outcome. The operation lasted 8 hours. During that time, Alan and Debbie could not find a place for themselves. First, they sat in the hospital, then wandered around the neighbourhood of the medical centre. After a while, they couldn't even remember how they filled the agonizing hours of waiting. Alan held Debbie's hand tightly. Her palm was cold, just icy, although May that year was hot and sunny. Alan impatiently took out his cell phone from his pocket every minute, twirled it in his hands, flipped through the news feeds. He was waiting for the call. And finally, the long-awaited call came. "Everything went well," Brenda's tired voice sounded on the phone. "It was hard, but we managed. Well done, your son is a hero. Details tomorrow, I have to go." Alan slumped helplessly on the bench. A smile played on his face. And his wife immediately understood everything. After the surgery, Kyle and his mum stayed at the clinic for further recovery, and Alan had to go back. His patients were waiting for him in the capital. A lot of work had accumulated during his enforced absence, but Alan was not frightened by that, especially now when everything was well with Kyle. Before his departure, he visited his former patient to express his gratitude. Brenda was sitting at the table, hastily writing something. When she saw Alan, she smiled and took a break from her urgent task. "Brenda, I don't even know what to say," Alan said, taking a seat across from her. "You saved my son. You saved all of us. I can't find the words to express how grateful I am." "I was just doing my job," Brenda shrugged. "Consider us even." "Did your father take you to the sea?" Alan suddenly asked. He had been curious about this for all these years. "Yes," Brenda smiled warmly. "It was a wonderful trip. It was the first time our family went to the sea together. We swam, sunbathed, and sat in cafes every day." "They truly cared about you," Alan praised. "Back then, you needed positive emotions and sea air much more than medicine. Your parents have done their best for your health." "I even got to swim with a dolphin," Brenda reminisced. "Well, not in the open sea like in my dream, but at a dolphinarium. It must have cost my parents a lot of money. We didn't always have much, but that summer I felt like the whole world revolved around me." "Well, you deserved it," Alan said seriously. "You were a true hero, weren't you? We all marvelled at how resilient you were. Not all kids have that kind of strength." "Do you remember that box I gave you at your discharge?" Brenda asked. "Of course. It still holds a special place in my collection on my shelf. Whenever I see it, I think of you. That little girl with big eyes and a cheerful spirit." "Have you seen what was inside?" Brenda inquired. Inside? Alan was surprised. I didn't even realise there was anything inside. Oh, so you've never opened it? Brenda's eyes lit up like two torches. When you come back, you must open it. Of course, I can't wait, Alan responded truthfully. And now Alan was standing in his office, holding the very box adorned with paper flowers. The lid was secured with a small homemade lock that was difficult to manoeuvre with his thumbs. At the bottom of the box lay a picture of Brenda, smiling. Her long blonde hair was styled in curls, pinned beautifully to the side, and her lips were lightly touched with pink lipstick. Brenda wore a sky blue dress with short sleeves that day. The illness was already evident, with dark circles under her eyes. But Brenda beamed at the camera, clutching a bouquet of scarlet roses to her chest. It was probably her favourite photo, where she looked like a princess. Girls always love such things. Alan smiled. The little girl in the photo had so much ahead of her. A serious illness, a long treatment journey, and ultimately victory. The long-awaited voyage to the sea, swimming with dolphins, education, work at the hospital. But on that day, Brenda had no idea what lay ahead. She was just a little girl, dressed up, beautiful and full of happiness. Alan turned the photograph over, and, as expected, there was a message on the back. "Thank you for life," Alan read on the back of the photo. "I was told that you saved me. I will live now, go to the sea, have children of my own, and become a doctor to save children. I promise you that. You'll see, in many years you'll be proud of me." Alan looked at the scrawled lines written by the child's hand and felt overwhelmed with emotion. He had not only saved little Brenda's life, but he had also determined her future fate. The girl had promised to become a doctor, and she did. "I've just opened the box," Alan texted. Brenda responded with a long string of hearts, and Alan was sure that when Brenda received his message, she smiled. Time passed, and Kyle had already recovered. Debbie, who had been with her son in the hospital, couldn't believe his newfound energy. "Where does he get so much energy?" she joyfully exclaimed during phone conversations with her husband. "He races, jumps and is constantly on the move, and he has so many ideas. He's cramped in the hospital corridors and the small yard. I can't wait for him to be discharged." "That's great," Alan rejoiced. And finally the day of the discharge arrived, and Alan purposely arrived early. He wanted to talk to Brenda again, ask her a few questions and thank her once more. Now he had a healthy, energetic child, a happy, calm wife, and a bright future, all thanks to Brenda. Alan found out in advance when Brenda's planning meeting ended. He intended to seize the short period of time between the meeting and patient rounds to talk to her. Brenda was genuinely pleased to see Alan in her office. "I knew you'd come," she said. "Let's go to my office. I'll update you on Kyle's progress and outline a plan of action. Would you like some coffee? I have a box of cakes." Alan nodded with a smile. They sat in Brenda's office enjoying coffee and delicious eclairs, conversing like old friends. "Your boy is good now," Brenda rejoiced. "I didn't expect such a great outcome. I thought he would need another operation, but his body coped and recovered. For the first couple of years, he should avoid excessive exercise, but regular physical activity is important. Your wife knows the details. Once a year, you should have Kyle see a cardiologist for an ultrasound and cardiogram. And that's it. Kyle can lead a completely normal life." "It's like a miracle. Kyle hasn't led a perfectly normal life since birth." His problems were largely due to his cardiac condition, which was difficult to detect. Numerous illnesses triggered the progression of the disease, and it was finally discovered. But now, everything should be back to normal. "Thank you, Brenda. But tell me, how did you achieve all this?" "I can be very goal-oriented," Brenda grinned. Brenda's goal was formed as soon as she learned from her parents that she was on the verge of life and death. Her mother and father supported her, but soon lost all hope after repeated denials from doctors, who claimed that any medical intervention was futile. Then, unexpectedly, a courageous surgeon agreed to perform surgery on Brenda. He did not provide any prognosis, but assured them that he would do everything in his power. Brenda's parents had no other option. Thus, they agreed to the experimental procedure, giving their eldest daughter a small but precious chance of life. When it became evident that Brenda was recovering, her father joyfully revealed the truth to her. "So if it hadn't been for Dr. Allen, I wouldn't exist anymore?" the little girl clarified, looking at the adults. "Yes, daughter," nodded her father. "He saved your life, and now I will pray for him always." Brenda's mind was overwhelmed by what she had heard. She understood that babies are born, grow up, and eventually become old men and women. She knew that people, like their old neighbour or her father's grandparents, pass away. However, the concept of children dying had never crossed her mind before. "And you're not mistaken?" The girl seriously questioned her parents, her eyes filled with water. "Children haven't experienced life yet. They still have to study, and then have their own children. They can't die." That night, Brenda couldn't sleep as the injustice weighed heavily on her mind. She contemplated how sad and frightening it is. However, she also realized that she herself could have. It was her doctor who saved her. "I want to be like Dr. Allen," Brenda declared firmly. She spoke this phrase aloud into the emptiness and darkness of her hospital room. From that point on, Brenda had no doubts about who she wanted to become when she grew up. At first, her parents only smiled at her fervent declaration that she would become the world's best doctor and cure all children. But Brenda persistently pursued her goal. She watched medical channels, asked to buy anatomical books. Gradually, she began to understand the complex Latin names, studied the basics of genetics, and read chemistry textbooks from the local library. She became engrossed in medicine, finding it incredibly interesting and fascinating. Her parents tried to dissuade her from entering the medical academy, suggesting other options. But Brenda stood her ground. Medicine was her only choice. And Brenda succeeded. She got accepted into the medical academy and immersed herself in her studies. Every year, Brenda became more convinced that she had chosen the right path. She was a highly active student, reading a lot of additional literature and participating in various projects and programs. However, during her studying, she realized that she was more attracted to cardiology than her original plan of becoming a neurosurgeon like Alan. As a result, Brenda became a surgeon in the cardiology department. During her first operation, Brenda's heart pounded so hard that it seemed to echo through the entire operating room. She was nervous, but also immensely happy. Finally, she would be doing what she had strived for her whole life: saving people. As time passed, Brenda gained experience and also engaged in scientific research. She was particularly interested in complex and non-trivial cases. The gratitude of parents and the smiles of cheerful little patients warmed Brenda's soul. She felt that she was bringing goodness, joy and light into the world. It was not in vain that her favourite doctor had saved her all those years ago. "You see, it's an astonishing thing," Brenda reflected. "You saved me 20 years ago, which means that if it weren't for you, these children whom I saved would not have survived. That's incredible. I became a doctor. Some of your patients became teachers, engineers, drivers. All of them are doing good. All of them are doing something important and meaningful. That's how goodness spreads throughout the world. Alan looked at Brenda and smiled. He felt the same way she did.